Welcome, everyone, to our discussion of Carla Power's book, Home, Land, Security, De-Radicalization, and the Journey Back from Extremism. I'm Allison McQueen, an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and the director of the undergraduate program at the McCoy Family Center for Ethics and Society here at Stanford University. One of the many exciting events supported by the Center for Ethics is a writer's workshop, where an author without a university appointment participates in a workshop to discuss a book manuscript that deals with issues of ethics and public life. And this is where we at the Center for Ethics and Society first encountered Carla Power's wonderful and challenging book, Home, Land, Security. Carla Power is a writer and journalist who has written for a range of publications, including Newsweek, Time, Vogue, The Guardian, Foreign Policy, and the New York Times Magazine. Her first book, If the Oceans Were Ink, An Unlikely Friendship and a Journey to the Heart of the Quran, documents her years studying with Sheikh Mohammed Akram Nadwi, a traditional Islamic scholar. The book was a finalist for the Pulitzer as well as the National Book Award. Power's second book, Home, Land, Security, emerged from the first, from hard questions that the first book raised for both readers and for Carla herself about extremism. The result is a book that is uncomfortable, and uncomfortable precisely because it is so unflinchingly humane. Power shows why extremism's simple narratives and comforting certainty are so appealing. She shows us that understanding this appeal is not an act of naive idealism, but of ruthless pragmatism. Unless we understand the appeal of extremism, we will struggle to find a way to live together. I'm thrilled to say that Home, Land, Security is also a finalist for the Pulitzer. Carla will be in conversation with Sarika Thiruvanagama from Stanford's Department of Anthropology. Thiruvanagama is the author of In My Mother's House, Civil War in Sri Lanka, along with numerous articles and book chapters. And her research focuses on the intersection of political mobilization and domestic life. Now, before I hand things over to Carla and Sarika, let me make three important announcements. First, we will be taking audience questions throughout the discussion, rather than saving them just for the end. Second, if you're a member of the audience and you'd like to submit a question, please do so through the Q&A function. And third, all attendees today have been entered into a raffle to win a signed copy of Carla's book. And if you're one of the lucky 20 winners, you'll be notified by email. And now I'm going to hand things over to Carla for some initial remarks to kick us off. So take it away, Carla.
Thank you, Allison. I really appreciate that lovely introduction. I should just tweak one thing about it, that Homeland Security is not a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Maybe in the future, I would hope, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. And I really want to thank Stanford's McCoy Family Center for Ethics in Society and the Center for International Security and Cooperation for sponsoring this event and letting me be a part of what promises to be an amazing year of talks on ethics and political violence. Some 2 years ago, it now seems like a lifetime ago, I was lucky enough to attend a workshop, a writer's workshop at the Center for Ethics, and they hosted me for a week on campus and provided just an amazing smorgasbord of academics in various fields who read and critiqued an earlier stage of the draft of this book. And though all the shortcomings are my own, I should say that Homeland Security has benefited so much from the support of the Center for Ethics and the Stanford faculty. I want to thank in particular Joan Barry, Rob Reich, Diana Aguilera, and Pam Goodman, as well as, of course, Allison and Sarika for giving their time and expertise. Writing Homeland Security was a huge privilege, in part that it allowed me to travel from Lahore to Long Island and Jakarta to Denmark to talk to a range of people, from Stanford professors to parole officers, from Pakistani brigadier generals and housewives to German neo-Nazis turned rehabilitation experts, to aspiring suicide bombers and retired militants and their families. Now, one of these people I met along the way was Nafis Hamid, an American cognitive scientist who studies the neuroscience of extremist thought patterns as part of a larger project on how people get into and possibly can be persuaded to get out of political violence. He was based in Barcelona for a time, and where he ran 2 experiments measuring sacred values, those values that somebody holds so dear that they are impervious to material gain. So he gathered a group of recent Pakistani immigrants to the city of Barcelona who had expressed support for Lashkar-e-Taiba, an Al-Qaeda affiliate in Pakistan. And to qualify for the experiment, they had filled out surveys and had said that they approved of armed jihad as well as violence against civilians, and that they'd be willing to carry out a violent action in support of these values. So, having interviewed these participants to figure out which values they considered to be sacred, Hamid put them in a brain scanner and gave them an fMRI measuring blood flow to the certain regions of the brain. And while they were in the scanner, above their heads would flash a series of statements, such as, for example, strict Sharia should be implemented in Muslim countries, or all Muslim countries must be replaced by a single caliphate. They were given joysticks and asked to score their reactions on a scale from 1, which meant that they were impervious to it, left them cold, to 7, which meant that they were willing to die for it. Afterwards, he examined the areas of the brain which had the most activity by measuring blood flow to them, as well as the part, and for the values they considered non-sacred, he found that both the parts of the brain that controlled emotions, as well as the parts of the brain that control reflective thinking, abstract reasoning, and self-control, those lit up when they didn't care about the values. But when it was a sacred value, something the participant would fight and die for, only the parts of the brain controlling emotions lit up. No blood flowed to the parts that handle logic and reason. Now, Hamid took away from this that when somebody holds a particular value as sacred, it's a waste of time trying to reason with them. You're not going to persuade them to rethink a sacred value by having an earnest conversation about readings about peace and pluralism from the Quran, say, or making the argument that Muslims were freer to pursue the range of Islamic practices in Western countries than in the so-called Islamic State. To employ reason when it came to sacred values, Hamid told me, was a lot like being a boxer trying to punch someone's shadow, hoping to hurt them. You're not going to land a punch, he said. By trying to use reason or logic, you're not even activating the parts of the brain that are involved. Those parts of the brain that process reason or logic aren't even online. And I bring up Hamid's experiment because I've been thinking about it as the United States sort of marks the 20 years since the 9/11 attacks, partly because it coincided with the ungainly withdrawal, or indeed could be argued defeat, in Afghanistan. It seems like a moment when we are increasingly willing to examine our own sacred values and certainties, those so closely held that it has taken us 2 decades for us to hold them up to the light. Among those sacred values that we're slowly starting to scrutinize, I would argue, is how we've talked about terrorism and extremism for the last 2 decades. One of the national sacred values that ossified in the wake of the tragedy of 9/11 was that terrorists were foreign and Muslim. It took the attacks on the Capitol this January for many white Americans to recognize what statistics show and what people of color had long known from experience, that the most serious threat to American citizens is not foreign, dark, and Muslim, but white and American made. Another tenet was that Islamist violent extremism was somehow an existential threat to American society, intent on destroying our way of life. But as terrorism researcher Charlie Winter, who's at King's College London, has noted, the only existential threat to our values lay not in the attacks themselves, but in the way we respond to them. After that terrible day, the Bush administration framed 9/11 as a turning point in our nation's history, grave enough to suspend a raft of key American laws and beliefs and to pursue exceptional means to take on what were deemed exceptional enemies. Our country's response included the use of torture, rendition, and disappearance of terror suspect. It included the establishment of Guantanamo Bay, which put the accused out of reach of US courts, and the construction of the legal concept of unlawful combatants, which stripped suspects of their Geneva Convention rights. With the rise of the Islamic State about a decade later, we again told ourselves that we were dealing with an exceptional problem that needed exceptional solutions. The fear of homegrown terrorists meant that arrests were made in the all too spacious, I would say, pre-criminal space. We had American teenagers jailed for actions no more threatening than texting boasts to friends or booking airline tickets to the Middle East. Across the country, police and sheriff's offices were compiling lists of potential signs of radicalization. In Boston, frustration at US policy and events around the globe merited suspicion. In Lincoln, Nebraska, paying debts prior to a terrorist attack was a risk indicator, while in Oakland, searching for a sense of meaning and community was deemed suspect. I've done all three, I should add. And were I Muslim rather than a white middle-aged woman, I suspect I would have invited suspicion in those 3 cities. 2 long wars on. One wonders where we'd be if we'd refused to see Islamist terrorists as extraordinary. Had we resisted al-Qaeda's claims to be all-powerful and framed them as a danger, real enough, but not an existential threat? Had media headlines and leaders not flattened the idea of a terrorist into an inhuman force driven by otherworldly evil, but as people who chose militancy because of socio-political trends, complex personal circumstances, or a toxic cocktail of both? Had we believed that many terrorists were not irredeemable, but plausibly people who could change? Would that have had an effect on the fact that global deaths from terrorism increased 9-fold between 2000 and 2014? Or that during the same era, the number of jihadist militants around the world tripled from 32,000 to 110,000? My starting point for this book was to try to chip away at the stereotypes of jihadist extremists in the headlines. Those people that we were told sort of sprang into being on the Earth's surface as fully formed monsters, or at the very least, as fighters high on religious ideology. Hannah Arendt may have shown us the banality of Nazi evil, but for the mainstream Western audience, the modern jihadi terrorist remains otherworldly, denied banality, denied the context that might allow her or him reason, and that might explain, though not excuse, the reasons that they too picked up their cause. So I set off on my investigation to find the stories of both jihadis and to a lesser extent far-right extremists. And I found an astonishing range of reasons people join, and some of them were pretty banal. There was the gun enthusiast who had failed his army entrance exam twice and so joined a militant group instead. Or the upper middle class teenage schoolgirl, daughter of a successful Indonesian civil servant, who persuaded 26 members of her extended family to migrate to the Islamic State for reasons ranging from a better work-life balance to free medical care. Or the Pakistani boys so poor that they take the Taliban's $10 fee for planting a roadside bomb in Baluchistan, or are tempted to join the group after a Talib offers them a ride in an SUV or a bit of attention or lunch money. The closer one looks, the drivers for militancy are not simply the failings of the individual or an individual group of people or an individual faith, as they are so often cast by tabloid headlines or populists, but broader systemic failures or injustices. Though it's easy to cast militants as outsiders, as alien, particularly it's easy, I might add, for those militants who are minorities. Militants can also serve as maps to the failures or weaknesses in a society, if only we care to look. And my first sense of this framing came, strangely enough, in Denmark, where I went to the town of Aarhus, which has a famous and innovative rehabilitation program for militants, whose critics call it hug a terrorist. There's a little yellow house behind the police station where detectives who are trained in this sit and welcome in people who have returned from the Islamic State when that was still going on, or people at risk of radicalization. And they invite them in for coffees. And these relationships can last for years and years, sometimes thanks to the well-funded Danish welfare state. There have been militants who have been working with policemen for 7 years and have been helped to find jobs and apartments and university places. The underpinning of this program is that within, at least within Aarhus and to some extent in other cities around Denmark, radicalization, and even for a time joining the Islamic State, although the law later changed, is seen much like other antisocial behaviors. And the drive behind the programs is to give people drawn to extremism an alternative life that makes sense. As the head of Copenhagen's unit on extremism told me, he said, we don't say, what's your problem? We say, okay, what is your problem and how can we help you? While we've tended over the last few years in particular, as we've become more aware of the issues of white supremacy in the United States, to file people's problems under the sort of grouping of hatred, the roots, of course, can be deeper or wider than a mere emotion. Sarah Chase, in her brilliant investigation of how corruption threatens global security, points out that when she interviewed Taliban supporters right after the 2001 invasion by the United States, it was discussed at government corruption rather than any sort of ideology that helped recruitment. Out of 100 Taliban, she figures less than a quarter were real, she writes. The rest had taken up arms in disgust at the government. And looking elsewhere, revulsion at, say, another form of systemic injustice, the patriarchy, can also boost militancy's appeal. In Nigeria, limited life choices for many rural Nigerian women make joining Boko Haram seem a liberation of sorts, according to Dr. Fatima Akilu, a psychologist and founder of the Nigerian government's de-radicalization program. if you're a woman from a village where you'd be married off at 9 or 10, a pitch from a Boko Haram combatant to join up and marry him could sound very attractive, she says. They'll say, if you join our group, you can actually choose what you want to do. You can have slaves, you can have a job, you can work as a cook, you can assemble bombs. And breaking with the customs of many rural villages, with Boko Haram, these women were promised the right to divorce their husbands in case of unhappy marriages. And so this was empowerment. And there's an interesting corollary to this story, which was when the Nigerian government tried to rehabilitate former Boko Haram recruits. The men were far easier to rehabilitate than the women, simply because the men had less to lose. Some people are drawn by the promise of a brighter future, and others by the specter of a nostalgic past. The first militant story I heard was that of Rashid Ben Yahya, a boy from Birmingham, England, who'd left his family at 19 to join the Islamic State. And this was an encounter, it was the earliest encounter in my reporting, and it brought back to me how even after decades of trying to write against any Islamophobic tendencies, I had assumed that this kid would be a hardened fundamentalist fighter. And instead, and admittedly, this is the narrative told by his mother, and we all know mothers are not necessarily the most reliable of witnesses, but nonetheless, her description of him and is a sort of Peter Pan figure. He started off dazzled by the thought of a real Islamic caliphate, a brand new place to start. He watched it on TV and got very excited. He wanted to go there and help Syrian kids. In addition, his mother believes he was attracted or could have been attracted by the promise of an easier, simpler life, one that harkened not just back to the paradise promised by ISIS recruiters of a society built on the principles of the Prophet Muhammad, ostensibly, but also harkened back to a very personal nostalgia, to the happy 4 years that he'd spent living with his family when he was a kid. And when I talk to rehabilitators, whether in Germany, where they have some 720 de-radicalization programs, or in Pakistan, where Sabayun, a boys' boarding school in the Swat Valley, was what terrorism academic John Horgan at the University of Georgia has called the world's best de-radicalization program. The key for individual success seems to be highly individualized, long-term, and multi-pronged approach. But I would hope that in addition to that, we would, as a society, start to examine the sacred values that we have as a country, and those that we may, in some cases, have adopted briefly post 9/11, to see if we can use our freedoms to rethink ways we frame violent extremism and the ways we act on it. Thank you.
So thank you so much for that, Carla. It's a great introduction into the book itself. And I'm just going to speak for a little while. And I just want to reiterate to the audience that you can ask questions throughout, and I'm going to start with a few questions and then bring in audience questions as well. And thanks to the McCoy Center for inviting me to moderate the Q&A sessions and begin this conversation. So, Carla, I was just thinking about what you said, and it sort of dovetails with what I feel is one of the central dilemmas of your book. And I guess that comes from my own work and personal history, I suppose. I'm someone who's from a minority community in Sri Lanka, and I've worked with both Tamils and Muslims who have been targeted by the Sri Lankan state as terrorists, and as well reflect upon mass militancy and civil war in Sri Lanka. And I've also grown up as a refugee in the UK, and I've witnessed the sort of destructive effects of de-radicalization programs such as Prevent on Muslim communities in particular. And, from a perspective as a European refugee, the very deep intersection of immigration, tightening of immigration rules, and xenophobic discourse about foreigners with the rise of de-radicalization programs. So I think they're very linked, especially the density of them in Europe. And so I want to talk about that because while, one major theme of your book is obviously about meeting and understanding the lives of those designated extremists and their families who become vilified, as well as those who run the programs that encourages kind of very deeply personalized relationships with those who are otherwise seen as monsters. I think the other theme of the book, and you've talked about the persons in your preamble, but the other theme of the book is a very deep disquiet about these programs that comes through, and these framings, and whether these kind of stories of a life story that can be related to end well, is that sort of satisfaction we gain from that, whether that's in fact deeply problematic. And you point out throughout the book that Muslim communities are targeted as terrorists and problems, as opposed to right-wing military actors. And you also show that in countries like Germany and in the US, some of these right-wing military actors, though sometimes they're prosecuted, they often have very deep links with law enforcement and are part of sort of rising politically powerful movements and parties. And you ask throughout the book, can these small bore solutions that you describe be any substitute for structural changes that propel people towards forms of alienation? And you've just talked a little bit about that. And just to return to the immigration point, I think what's interesting for me in the book is how skeptical you are of how these schemes go hand in hand with these larger discourse on immigration and incarceration. And this comes out more strongly, I think, in the European and American chapters. So though you're very impressed by this Danish scheme, you do point out that it goes with this very rising xenophobia in Denmark and the country's new so-called ghetto laws, which criminalize immigrant communities in deeply inhumane ways, that you have these whatever the hugger, whatever they mean, but they also hasn't accepted refugees for the last 2 or 3 years and is deeply alienating its own immigrant communities. And, and this is, it's there throughout throughout the book as well, actually, you discuss criminalization and discrimination against Somali communities in Minnesota, and the fact that the US is so willing to wield war and incarceration at home and war abroad. And you constantly contextualize these programs in Europe with these sort of deeply nationalist views about citizenship and belonging and racism. And I really, at one point in the book, you kind of start to analyze these state-sponsored schemes, and you ask, how they bear to quote you, the imprint of the more dominant culture with it, and a more doctrinaire approach about what normalcy looks like. And you actually ask yourself, so what norms should people be de-radicalized into? And then you sort of go through, well, this country thinks it's this, and this country thinks it's that. And, the schemes you talk about in Pakistan are very linked to the Pakistani army and the interpenetration of the army into everyday life. And in Indonesia, none of these schemes can be absent of the presence of the Indonesian state and the Indonesian army in territories like Aceh, and the very draconian application of the Prevention of Terrorism Act in Indonesia. So I think it's really fascinating for me to read the book because this is all there in the book. You're constantly going between the schemes and getting to know these people, but then a sense of horror and fascination. And the value of the book is that you're good at showing your uncertainty about these schemes, even as you're engaging with the people caught up in them. Even as I think, a major part of your book is, okay, how do young people who turn to forms of action that might involve the possibility of violence and alienation, how do they how do we make pathways to belong and be part of communities again? But so that's why I want to ask you, given all of this, and we can say this about these individuals, how do we bring them back? But how are we to tackle these state, governmental, and other structurally powerful actors who sponsor these schemes and their impact and the fact that their ideas of integration and securitization are themselves extremely violent and extreme? And I wonder maybe if you can talk a little bit more about the questions you begin with in your first chapter, which ask if increasing surveillance of racialized communities along political agendas can indeed provide security. How do we deal or think about forms of human life, sustainable living, and care for each other, both within and across communities that does not implicate us in these deeply damaged interventions? And actually, my other question in relation to that dovetails with an audience question. And I have an audience question that says, which sort of is very like the other, my third part of this question. But the audience question is, the amount of resources required for these de-radicalization programs to succeed sounds immense, particularly when they must be personalized and long-term. Can they only be supported by the state? Or are there private programs focused on these efforts? And I think that's an interesting question to answer, because it gets back to the fact that none of the schemes that you talk about are at all separate from the state or armies. And in both in relation to the audience question, but my own question is not whether there should be private programs, but are de-radicalization programs only possible because they have a state, a connection? And so should we bear the cost of that? I mean, is there an acceptable benefit for the kind of interpenetration that involves? I mean, I think your book brings up all these questions. So let me stop there. I know this is a kind of metaphor of questions, and ask, just take your response.
Well, I had sort of the banner headline in my head for so much of it was, yes, what are we de-radicalizing to? And that seems to me to be the central ethical question. With not a couple of these programs are not actually state supported, not directly. I mean, in Indonesia, there's almost sort of a cottage industry of NGOs that are helping militants get on their feet again. And that's very much separate from the government programs. And just to, the issue of how do we sort of link up the kind of individual idea with the structural idea. I would say that throughout writing this book, the mental image, and this is sort of more a kind of nonfiction writing aside, but the mental image I kept sort of switchbacking between what were these two forms of security, the mother and the drone. And these images seem to me to distill two very different thinking about how we frame security. One is up close, one is launched from thousands of miles away. And I know from your own work, Sharika, you've explored how the domestic space intersects or doesn't with larger narratives of political violence. And I kept having unbidden these images of the mother and the drone as almost kind of platonic oppositions. The mother, or the ideal of the mother being emotional, personal, in it for the long haul, alive to nuance, certainly alive to self-recrimination and a sense of responsibility, and searching for the root causes in terms of her children. And this was not, this wasn't just a platonic ideal. This was certainly what I got talking to the 4 or 5 mothers who were willing to talk to me. And then set against that, of course, is this other form of security, the drone as this kind of binary, impersonal system. Binary because drone operators either find their target or they don't. And Famously, the security industry's pitch for predator drones to governments was that they did the quote, dull, dangerous, and dirty jobs that soldiers shouldn't risk bothering with. So I think one of the things that we unfortunately did after 9/11 that kind of stunted more creative ways to think about routes into extremism, whether these were state-sponsored de-radicalization programs or not, which is sort of because of the securitized atmosphere, we sort of created a cone of silence around the issue of terrorism in the interest of security. And this came out of, in part, the Patriot Act and its really broad definition of what material support of a terrorist group means. And it made it very tricky. I write a lot about a sort of freelance, although it did get money from CVE, federal CVE programs, but Heartland Security in Minneapolis, which was kind of came up with the structure for the single and certainly the first de-radicalization program in the United States that had exactly a cohort of one. Even then, it was very tricky for the rehabilitator in the sense that there's a real fear of being seen as part of material support for terrorism. We don't have a mechanism really for people to go into confidence with young people who are feeling that they might be in danger of radicalization or so on. So this cone of silence and fear, I think, was really not particularly beneficial. If you're German or Austrian or French and you're a worried parent, you can call radicalization hotlines. And, in Germany, where, they have hundreds and hundreds of prevention and de-radicalization programs, some at the federal level, others much more local, others NGOs, non-governmental organizations you can turn to. But where, the post 9/11 sense of surveillance in mosques and Muslim communities really had the effect, as writers like Arun Kundnani have detailed in much greater depth. It had the result that they sort of choked off legitimate political debate, and Muslim leaders and mosque organizations were afraid to discuss legitimate topics, and the effect was sort of to shut down debate. So that in North America and the UK, I think the families of people who went off to, say, join the Islamic State felt tremendously isolated, worried that seeking help or speaking out would implicate them somehow. They were worried about losing their jobs. The Canadian mother, Christiane Boudreau, whose son Damien went off to Syria to fight with an Al-Qaeda affiliate, says she had trouble getting a job after she went public about where her son had gone to, because she was, as a headhunter who was trying to help her find an accountancy job, told her, "You are seen as the mother of a terrorist." And sadly, I think the securitized environment meant that parents weren't just afraid to seek help with the problem, but also with finding solutions to the problem of radicalization. The New York Times detailed a story of a Silicon Valley executive whose son was stopped at San Francisco International Airport by FBI agents on suspicion of his wanting to join ISIS. And Mr. Shafi had tried, after his son was arrested, to work with a German de-radicalization expert and cobble together a sort of program to work with his son, folks from a psychologist, an imam, and other people, hoping that if he, if they tried this program, his son might have avoid prison. That didn't happen. His son ended up waiting for 40 months in prison and was then acquitted by a jury, and then later was arrested again and is now out. But it was a long road, and it had the ultimate effect, according to Mr. Shafi, that his first bit of advice to parents worried about the radicalization of their kids was, don't say anything to the government, don't cooperate. That's a sorry situation. And it really shows how a securitized environment, at least in our country, really pitted communities against one another and wasn't helpful in the long run, I don't think. As you say, these small bore solutions focused on individual are great if they work, but they're also built on a highly individualistic, expensive, long-term model rather than a communal one. And they certainly don't address the wider causes that can drive people apart and possibly polarize them so much that you get added attraction of extremism. When it comes to individual solutions, I think if we have the humility and curiosity to look at approaches in other countries, whether it's Indonesian programs that frame former militants as not evil, but wayward Muslims, or that try to get them to mix with new networks. I went to a workshop conference in Indonesia for former jihadis, and the idea was to mix them up with academics teaching Islamic studies and various other things, so that they can move away from their old jihadi gang and sort of gently join other networks in society. Or we should look at Pakistani programs, which are not, and again, are not necessarily funded by the government, but are so hyper local that they're a matter of neighbors working together rather than outside forces. Or look to German programs that can harness everything from gender roles to punk rock and skateboarding to try to broaden people's worldviews and critical thinking skills. And when I think about it, when I think about how the United States might want to engage in a new sort of kind of conversation about this, I think of two inspirations, and one is in the US and the other is in Europe. I think in the US, I think we should take a page possibly from the Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movements, because both have been so excellent at connecting the dots between individual experiences and larger systemic issues. They've shown mainstream America that the tragedies of people like George Floyd or Breonna Taylor are in fact symptoms of larger systemic issues in the United States. And while I'm not obviously equating the problem of extremism and racism or sexism, I do think they've shown us ways to expand the political and social imaginations and to turn the telescope back on our own societies and examine the larger issues and problems that are at play here, and to try to interrogate the structures that perpetuates a culture that helps incubate extremism. And where once, if you look at Black Lives Matter, where once, white Americans could sort of cast racism as extraordinary, as limited to the Ku Klux Klan or certain regions or so on, we're now learning as a nation how woven in racism is into the national fabric. And hopefully that's going to help us shift some things. And both movements have prompted American society to take responsibility for these problems. And it is going to take an act of sort of heroic curiosity and an analytical imagination that doesn't just stretch into our own history and institutions, but needs to stretch way beyond our borders to the countries we invade or bomb or where we prop up dictators. But we need to acknowledge that violent extremism isn't beyond the pale of civilization, but actually is a part of it.
And maybe I can just take you up on that, because I mean, I agree. And I find the US is full of enormous amounts of political violence dealt at all levels. And I sort of, to go back to some of what you're saying, and also, you began with Nafis. I actually disagree with a lot of the way that experiment is set up and the assumptions made around it. I'll put that out there.
Okay.
But I think that I think it makes a certain set of equivalences. And your book is quite careful in some ways not to make straightforward equivalences between different situations or different communities and so on. And I think that one of the questions I was interested in related to the de-radicalization schemes is, do you think they're different in different countries depending on whether the de-radicalization is aimed at a vulnerable minority community who might already be seen as potentially traitorous or potentially a security threat, or if they're aimed at the kind of ethnic or religious or racial majority or imagined heartland community who might be seen as, they're wayward, but they can be brought back into a fold that already welcomes them. Because, sometimes countries run de-radicalization schemes aimed at different constituents in these ways.
Absolutely. I think of a short-lived and ill-fated and rightly so scheme in France, where the idea was that militants would come in and learn French history and sing La Marseillaise and so on, which is almost self-parodic in its kind of cloth-eared attempts to create little citoyennes. And you're absolutely right. I think countries like certainly the Swat Valley in Pakistan or in Indonesia, the conception is, look, we can work with these people. They're in part because, particularly in programs in the Swat Valley, these are our brothers and fathers and sisters and so on that may have been dragged into militancy, but as long as one has a very local program, there's a recognition of the structures that are drawing people into extremism. And in a way, the old saw that all politics is local. All extremisms are local in a way, and that to be alive to the very local nature of why people might need to do this, I think is absolutely certain. And that's in part why I'm so suspicious of top-down programs in particular. Because they haven't seemed to work very well, and B, because this statist notion of imprinting a mainstream vision onto people is particularly in countries where you've got freedom of speech and freedom of belief, very difficult, if not suspect.
I'm seeing that we only have 8 minutes left. So I think you and I could talk for a long time, but I just want to encourage the audience that if you do have any further questions, to sort of put them in, and maybe so I can. Well, so there's a couple of questions on whether, and I think it's sort of related to the Nafis Summit experiment, which one question is, when rehabilitating extremists, is it best to discredit their belief system or use it to encourage more rational decisions? And I put it there, but I also just want to qualify that I find that the idea that there's a distinction made between rational decisions. You can make very rational decisions to commit incredibly violent acts. And I'm not entirely sure of that distinction between belief systems and rational decisions, but I'm going to pose it to you as something that is a question that is frequently asked and you encounter all the time in your book about, okay, how do you do this? Is it belief systems, or do you use belief systems to encourage decisions or decision making that those running the schemes would understand to be more around sort of dominant norms?
I mean, I think that one of the main surprises I had early on was belief systems are not necessarily all that important, particularly when you're focused on followers rather than leaders. I'm sure that there are some hardcore ideologues who are motivated solely by ideology and join up. But when you're focusing on followers, as I was, that it's much more common for people to join up for, again, banal reasons like yearning for transcendence or wanting to belong, or thinking it far more exciting to join a group than to work at a dead-end job. So, and when I talk to various people involved in the de-radicalization space, most people seem to say we're not going to engage in belief systems. We're not going to argue at it, especially initially. That comes much later. One of the more sort of successful groups that I dealt with, who dealt with far right extremists, say, our watchword is, we'll go up to these youth who are in Nazi gangs in the city of Bremen and say to them, okay, so you're a Nazi, but you're also a human being. We reject the Nazism, but we want to try to engage with you initially as a human being. And then after some time, there might be discussion of beliefs.
Yeah, and I noticed that throughout your book, you focus in on relationships and how people make these relationships, and how important you find relationships and connections and relationships. And sometimes those comes through the schemes, but sometimes they seem to really come outside of the schemes. Some of the most right in your book.
Absolutely. And I do think, another image that I kept coming back to again and again was connective tissue and societal connective tissue. And, when I look at it on a larger scale, I mean, it's the last chapter in my book, is this inspirational city in Belgium where there was a real leader who, Bart Summers, who was the mayor, and he took over when, a third of the town had voted for a far right extremist party. And his town also sat on sort of the railroad track that for a time was the richest seam for ISIS fighters in the Western world. And he managed to, by sort of creating a citizenry around the notion of relationships and around the notion of keeping people safe and moving away from ideology. I mean, he picked from both the left and the right playbook. You know, there are more police there than there are elsewhere. I'm sorry, more surveillance cameras, my mistake, than there are any place else in Belgium, in Mechelen. But there are also, but he also has sort of publicly said after terrorist atrocities in Belgium, say, you know, these terrorists are our terrorists. They were born and raised here, and we have to deal with them. So he's sort of skewing the idea of what it means to have relationships in this city. And he also sees, he's been very, very careful with his rhetoric to make people think about themselves, not in terms of old Mechelen people and newcomers or immigrants, but rather that everybody there, he's like, my family's been here for 18 generations, but I am the first generation in my family to live in a highly multicultural, highly diverse Mechelen, and that is really important. So that kind of thinking, I think, is really important on a city level, if not just on a de-radicalization level.
And so I think, Carla, I mean, we have a minute left, so I've got one last audience question, and then I think we should, end. But we have a question from the audience, if you can answer in brief. On this note, how do you think some of these strategies that you have observed in other countries would work in combating growing white extremism in the US? I mean, there's quite a bit. There's the QAnon. So I mean, this is an interesting audience question. So I thought maybe we can end on.
I think there's a lot to learn. Again, I get back to think local, and don't try to plant, things that don't just try to import things wholesale. But I do think, Germany, Indonesia, Pakistan, all have tried to think creatively and rather bravely about this, and they haven't been perfect. Obviously, all of them still have issues with militancy, but certainly in terms of strategies about talking to people who may be extreme or hate, anti-pluralistic. There are definitely methods, and it's in the book. So.
Thank you.
Well, let me thank both Carla and Sharika for a wonderful discussion today. And I want to encourage everyone who hasn't already bought or won a copy of Carla's book to go out and buy it now. As Carla so eloquently noted in her introduction today, recent events both abroad and at home make the questions raised by Homeland Security urgent ones for all of us today. And through reading it, I hope we can all muster the heroic curiosity she referred to, that we need to confront the challenges of extremism. So thank you all for coming, and I hope to see you all at future events hosted at the McCoy Family Center for Ethics. Bye for now.